Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us today. We're beginning our fourth and final talk of this track with Dr. Kristen Wickert and her talk on fungi and their relationships with plants. So without further ado, I'm going to begin introducing Dr. Kristen Wickert. Over the past 8 years, Dr. Kristen Wickert has utilized the social media app Instagram to educate the general public on the natural world. The posts to her personal Instagram account with the username KDubs the Hiking Scientist include information about organisms and conservation efforts to expose the public to the world around them. She focuses on the core concept that we can all contribute to caring for our ecosystem in our own backyards by avoiding planting exotic or invasive species and instead reintroducing native plant species that allow our landscapes to be habitat for native fauna and fungi. Her educational background includes a bachelor's in forest biology and a master's and PhD in plant pathology. Her master's work focused on endophytic and plant pathogenic fungi and eastern hemlock needles and their ability to act as facultative entomopathogens against the devastating insect hemlock woolly adelgid. During her PhD, she researched plant pathogenic fungi and controlling the invasive tree of heaven. So, the title of today's talk is Fungi and the Relationship with Plants. Kristen will cover the unique roles that fungi perform as they interact with plants in the environment. Fungi can act as hindrances and helpers to our ecosystem's function. We'll learn all about saprotrophs, plant pathogens, mycorrhizae, and the mysterious endophytic fungi that all influence micro and macro environments, both natural and human influence. I'm sorry if I mispronounced any of those scientific words. Thank you so much, Kristen, for being with us today, and we look forward to your talk. Without further ado, Dr. Kristen Wickert.
We're going to talk about kind of probably an oddball thing for your conference, but we're going to talk about fungi. And I work with many different species of fungi, and I also think that they are absolutely beautiful. So we're going to first go over a little bit about who this person is that's talking to you, because I probably am a little bit out there compared to the other speakers at this conference. But like Molly said, I have a few degrees, which I've learned a lot from. I have a forest biology degree that I got at Penn State, and I also have a master's and a PhD in plant pathology. And a lot of people ask me, what? When I say that, even my mom gets a little confused when I say what plant pathology is. Really easy. It's just a study of disease-causing agents in plants. So that's like your bacteria, nematodes, anything that makes your plants look not good, like this guy right here. And I am a specialist in forest fungal pathogens. So there's me working outside, looking for fungi that make trees sick. And I have a lab where I also grow them out on little petri plates, which we're going to look at a fun picture today, all about that. I also work with insects and how they interact with fungi. And I am speaking here today as my weird alter ego, KDubs the Hiking Scientist on Instagram. And I really appreciate all the support. And for those of you that invited me here today and think I'm smart enough to do something like this. But what I have learned in all of my time in school and acting as a professional, the world of ecology is not black and white. And so while I'm out in the forest looking for fungi that cause disease in trees, which is super specific, there's usually something really crazy going on where fungi or the plants have a different weird ecological role. So your session here is all about building relationships. So we're going to talk about the weird relationships that fungi have in the forest. And we first have to cover what are fungi. I never want to assume that everybody knows all this stuff, because really fungi are super cryptic even today. But they kind of have a bad rap, right? You're probably familiar with the strawberries that are in your fridge rotting away. Everyone has this, everyone has had this, I know it. But they are organisms that spoil our groceries. They're diseases that irritate our skin. And recently, everyone is asking me if I've seen this. I have not. But they are nightmare generators, right? So everyone's talking about this HBO show, The Last of Us. I have not seen it. I don't have HBO, but I do work with the creatures that cause these really scary nightmare apparitions. So these are cicadas that are in Arizona that have the cordyceps fungi growing out of their brains and possibly altering their thoughts. But fungi are a lot more than that. Really, scientifically, they are amazing, beautiful organisms, and they are in their own kingdom. right? We are in kingdom Animalia, they are in the kingdom Fungi, and they're independent of plants. But we didn't know that for a long time. And if you go into any old libraries or any old, labs, you'll see books like this little golden guide appear, non-flowering plants. Well, for a long time, we thought that fungi were we didn't know where to put them, because they are not like plants in that they reproduce by spores, so they don't make seeds. They are made of chitin, a lot like, kind of like keratin, like our hair. They are not made out of cellulose like plants are. And they are heterotrophs. So that means that they don't have chloroplasts that automatically make their food. These organisms have to eat to get their energy. So they have to eat other things. And this is the tree of life as we know it today. It's pretty recent, from 2015. I bet there are more things that have been thrown in here, but you can see that fungi are really separated from plants, and we are in this same yellow grouping of animals and things that are kind of similar. But fungi are more closely related to us than they are to plants. And so this is a really simple, if you look up the tree of life on Wikipedia, this is the really simple example of where we all branch off on a phylogenetic tree. You can see animals and fungi are on these little branches closer to each other than plants are. And kingdom fungi was formally recognized in 1969. So that's not that long ago. We were landed on the moon at the same time. So pretty crazy that we could figure out how to put a rocket into space and humans, but we didn't know exactly what was all going on our own planet. But this is a very diverse kingdom, which is still being described and classified today. I took this little excerpt here from the tree of life diagram. You can see some of the lines are gray and some of the lines are black. If they're black, it means that there's a lot of organisms in that branch that have been sequenced genetically. So there's probably something that causes diseases in humans, because that's what we care about. But there's a lot of gray lines there. That means that we don't know exactly what's going on, because most fungi look just like the stuff that's growing on your strawberries in your refrigerator, right? They're kind of hard and cryptic to understand or classify. They're not like the beautiful orchids that we see that are always like, that is a Cypripedium acall, right? Fungi are very different and cryptic looking. So fungi, we probably are used to thinking of the things you buy at the grocery store and put on your pizza, but most of them don't look like that at all. And they also don't exist as that mushroom for very long at all either. Most of the organism's existence is spent in a substrate. And what I mean by that is where they live. So they can live in soil, wood, or other organic matter, and they exist there as hyphae. So these are hyphae, which are just strands. Pretty much, just imagine a big bowl of spaghetti, and an individual hyphae will go in through the substrate and colonize it and utilize it for energy. And just because it's people get this confused often, one individual strand of spaghetti is a hyphae, a whole bowl of spaghetti is the mycelium. So these mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of a fungus, because the whole thing is the mycelium and it needs to reproduce, so it sends up a mushroom, which makes spores. But most of the time, it's existing as a little fuzzy thing in whatever it likes to eat. And like I said, there's a ton of diversity in kingdom fungi. And this is just a few snippets of things that I see in kind of your neighborhood. I'm assuming most of you are on the East Coast, but just, out here in Appalachia where I live, we have fungi that are the typical mushrooms. We have fungi that live underneath logs and feed millipedes. We have fungi that eat the cicadas. And we also have fungi that you need a microscope to really appreciate. So there's a ton of diversity throughout all of kingdom fungi, and we are lucky enough to live on the same planet. So fungi function by utilizing enzymes to chemically break down their substrate. So they have things like lipase, breaks down lipids. They have cutinase, breaks down chitin, all sorts of stuff. And that's how they acquire their food. So they acquire the nutrients through their hyphal membranes, which classifies them as absorptive heterotrophs. So we consume things and dissolve them in our tummies with enzymes. Fungi pretty much just throw up a bunch of enzymes into their food and suck it back up and through their hyphae. And they also claim their territory with the use of chemical warfare. So if any of you like spalted wood for woodworking, these are different fungi making boundaries around their turf, saying, this is my spot, back up, don't come over. And they make these really crazy chemical boundaries, which you can make into beautiful things like earrings or bowls or guitars and charge a lot of money for. And all of this is important because it allows fungi to occupy specific niches, right? And that allows them then to evolve and do the many jobs and many relationships that they do throughout the ecosystem. So I like to group them in this really, really short condensed version of what fungi do as the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's symbiotic relationships, which are good, right? So we have examples. We're going to talk about lichens. We're going to talk about the beautiful mycorrhizae relationships, and we're going to talk about endophytes. The bad are the plant pathogenic and parasites, and that's what I work on mostly, the fungi that like to kill plants and eat them. And then there's also the ugly, which are the saprotrophs, eating something like a cow patty here in the fields. You'll see fungi doing just about anything. So let's start out with the symbiosis, right? We have the wonderful Sawiti and Doja cat being the perfect example with being best friends of a lichen. And this is actually how the word symbiosis came into existence. It was created by Albert Bernard Frank, and it was made to describe the relationship between lichens. It comes from symbiosis, which is Greek. I probably said that real wrong. But what's going on is there is a partnership of algae, and in this figure, it's called a photobiont, right? Photosynthesizing organism. And there's the chloroplasts in there that make food, right? Just like all sorts of plants. So they make photosynthesized sugars that they share with their partner, the mycobiont, the fungal organism. And that mycobiont makes an environment for the algae to live. It also protects the algae from solar radiation, because if you think about where lichens are, they're usually like, I mean, they're everywhere, but they're like on top of crazy mountains where it's super blasted by the sun. So these little poor algae need to have a protected environment. And if you look inside a lichen, you would see something like this. The fungus makes this really thick cortex that's kind of, rough to the touch, because it's protecting the algae inside of there and creating an environment where there's water, where there's, sharing of stuff going on. And sometimes you'll have cyanobacteria. I just have to say that, but most of the time it's fungi. But lichens are really exciting because we think we know everything, but we don't. This was a really recent discovery in 2016 that we thought we knew that lichens had a algal partner and one fungal partner. And it turns out that they actually have many fungal partners. So when you look at a lichen, you're actually looking at many different organisms in one spot. And they discovered this because they can separate the two organisms, but they could never make it back into a lichen in the lab. So these were grown on Petri plates, but if they put them together, they never got the lichen back. So they realized that there's many different fungi making that cortex of a lichen. And so if you ever want to read about lichens and their symbioses, you should make sure you look on Google Scholar early or later than 2017 for publications, because this is a new discovery in the wonderful world of fungi. So moving on, in the interest of time, because we're going to learn a lot, we're going to learn about the next symbioses you may have heard about. Mycorrhizae, they're very popular. It's a popular, exciting topic, especially with plants, because it's a beneficial relationship with plants. There's two types of mycorrhizal fungi. There's something called arbuscular, which is also called endomycorrhizal, and endo means inside. And then there's also ectomycorrhizal, which means outside. So it's a relationship full of caring and sharing, a lot like the lichens, where the fungi in the relationship, they increase access to water, they increase the ability of the plant to get phosphorus and nitrogen and other micronutrients that are really bound into the soil, and they provide a tolerance to pathogens and abiotic stress. And the plant in this arrangement shares carbon, of course, right? Because that's its big trade-off, but it's a little bit different in this scenario than the lichens, because now this time the plant is making a space for the fungus to live instead of the lichen making, backwards a place for the algae to be protected. So when we look at the asexual arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, that's a long name, we're really looking at things that we can't see without a microscope. So these are the really, really rudimentary first organisms that made symbiotic relationships with plants. They all belong to a certain group, but even though they all belong to a certain group with like limited diversity or constraints to put them in that group, they all produce really different, beautiful structures. So this picture was taken with the use of a microscope, and these are all different spores of the arbuscular mycorrhizae that are inside of tree roots. And the hyphae will actually go inside of the tree or the plant's root cells. And when it's ready to reproduce, even though it's asexually, it clonally makes spores that you can use to identify it. And this is the most common symbioses on the planet, considering fungi and probably everything else. Most plants, about 80% that we know of, have a relationship with these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Even though it's showing a tree in this image, they make relationships with grasses, herbaceous stuff, pretty much everything. And these arbuscular mycorrhizae have a long history of more than 400 million years old, and is thought to have contributed greatly to the colonization of land by plants. And we actually have fossil records of this. So this isn't just, a hypothesis. It's been confirmed that the first land plants, which look a lot like the club moss or the running pine, have structures and fossils that look a lot like hyphae of fungi. You might say it looks like roots. Well, if you're a super nerd that stares in a microscope all the day at hyphae, you can tell the difference between hyphal segments with septation versus roots. And I also have a personal discovery with this, where my best friend is a palynologist. She studies pollen, and I took some coal to her lab and we smashed it and treated it with a bunch of acid, and we were able to see that there were fungal propagules inside of pollen, inside of coal, that was millions of years old. So this relationship of fungi and plants is incredibly ancient and well defined in their own, existence together. So there's many studies that show that these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi help plants thrive. You can see a lot of really fun, convincing photos online when you look up with or without mycorrhizae plants. And the main thing is that fungi are able to access things like phosphorus from the soil that plants cannot. So if we look at this picture here, we see the root, and comparatively, it's small, but it's really big compared to that little tiny line of the hyphae. So the tiny line of hyphae have the ability to branch out and reach nutrients in a different way than those big giant roots can in the soil particles. And studies have shown that plants can enhance their growth by 50% when arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are present. And that means that the plants can invest more energy in their upright growth than their underground root growth, because the fungi are doing the underground work, and they're able to focus on reproduction. So making seeds and taking over and colonizing the free real estate that's there. And so here's just another little fun photo where these roots are really thick because they have the mycorrhizal fungi aiding them in accessing phosphorus, and then it makes more grass. And there are some really fun prairie pictures that show really tall grass and big roots with mycorrhizae associated. So you might be getting excited thinking, where can I purchase this stuff, right? For your garden's health or for your landscaping projects. Like if you buy a bunch of those seeds and you put them out in the environment, where can I get the fungi? Well, there are a lot of things on the internet that can trick you. And I'm not throwing any names out, mostly because I don't remember, but also because I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. But you can buy mycorrhizae, and it will be these spores, but a lot of them are not viable, which means that they're dead. And the reason that they're dead, if they come in like a plastic jar that's been sitting in a warehouse for a couple of months or years, is because these fungi are so ancient and so connected to their plant, they're called an obligate biotroph. And they depend on the plant for their carbon supply, meaning that if they are not associated with their plant, they're going to die. And so there's only a few species that can survive being separated from their host for a short amount of time due to larger spores and reserves. And a lot of those places that are selling them on the internet are not viable sources. However, there is a research source that if you are doing something like a remediation project or a big research project, West Virginia University actually has this collection called the INVAM collection. And this is what that picture is of. they store the fungi in these tubes with living plants that can allow them to be viable, and then you just put it in a bag and ship it out. So it's pretty cool. So moving on to the next type of symbioses, these are the ectomycorrhizal fungi, meaning outside. And these fungi don't go into the cells of the plant. They mutate the plant roots on the outside. And this is something you can actually see with your hands, like if you were doing, if you're especially in the forest, if you're pulling out roots, you can see these kind of mutated little stubby roots just in your hand. And it's because the fungi have made it that the roots don't need to do their job anymore, right? It's just like the AMF. The roots will kind of chill out and they'll let the fungi do all the work. And the energy will be focused upstairs instead of down under the ground. But these ectomycorrhizal fungi, they produce a covering around the outside of the root. And it's called a Hartig net, which is just named after the guy that discovered it because he had a crazy beard. So his weird beard kind of looks a lot like the Hartig net covering of the roots. And these fungi have sexual recombination, which means that there's going to be more diversity, more specialization, and they are the ones that make the mushroom. So when you're out in the forest and you see these mushrooms that are producing spores, they're in a relationship usually with trees, but sometimes other things. And they've mutated the roots to make it easier for them to exchange goods. And the ectomycorrhizal fungi are really popular, right? Because they produce these really big, delicious treats for us and animals in the forest, such as the morels, the big boletes out west, and then the black trumpets. These are all species of fungi that are associated with trees that produce an ectomycorrhizal symbiosis relationship, and they produce big mushrooms to make spores and make more symbioses. This is a really fun and cryptic, newish kind of discovery, the endophytic symbiotic relationship. These are fungi that we really kind of don't understand. They live inside of plant tissues, and you can find them in seeds. So here's a squash seed, and it just has fungal hyphae just living in there, and no one really knows what it's doing. It's not taking energy from the seed. It's not giving, as far as scientists can tell. And sometimes they are only there for one portion of the plant's life. So this fungus might be in the squash seed, and then that's it. It's not in the squash. It's real crazy. But they can be cultured. So we can grow them out in the lab and look at them and try to describe them. And they can be used then to also look at secondary metabolites that they create in those Petri plates. So they make things like flavonoids, steroids, stuff that we can use in other applications. And there's still a lot that's unknown about endophytes. Endo just means in, and phyte means plant, so they're growing inside the plant. But they're likely way more important in many ways that we probably don't understand. But what we think is going on is that they are sharing stuff in a really unmeasurable way. And sometimes it may be even that that plants are just sharing a safe space for these fungi to live. That's not the battlefield of microbes in the soil, right? Because there's a lot of stuff going on in the soil, and versus if you could have a really safe, nice home that's kind of sterile. And it may not be obvious to us, but they play an imperative role in the ecosystem for sure that we just don't understand yet. But conversely, there's always devil's advocate. You can have organisms that are functioning, just doing their own thing, and they don't give any benefit or any negative to the plant. They're just there. And sometimes we can make kind of a directed or educated guess about what the relationship is, that symbiosis, if you will. And one of the examples of a plant that grows here, well, everywhere, are the morning glories. So this is just a really pretty picture of a morning glory I like that was growing in my yard. And it has a relationship with fungi that are in the claviceps group. And that group of fungi is what makes LSD, right? So that's the really common one that people can understand, like it's making a really crazy chemical that's probably not good. And we can think that it might be a protective defense, that the morning glory said, hey, sure, you can live in me if you make a chemical that prevents insects or animals from eating me. And we make all these inferences, we make these good directive guesses, but there's still so many discoveries that need to be made. And there's a lot of different roles that these fungi can have, but they are just not described yet. And if they're on a different host, they do something else. So I have a fun experiment that I tried to do where an endophyte in real life affected the results of the scientific experiment. Since you guys are from the East Coast, you probably know Hemlock woolly adelgid. It's a really tiny little insect that is killing our eastern hemlock trees. And I was trying to use a fungus that eats insects to kill it, right? So I wanted to make dead Hemlock woolly adelgids by using a fungus that eats insects. And it worked in the lab, a sterile environment, but when I tried to do it in the forest, it didn't work. And so I looked at why didn't it work? And it is because of these endophytic fungi. So when I took the hemlock needles and cultured them on agar, fungi came out. And there was one little culprit that whenever it showed up on a plate or showed up in a needle, my experiment didn't work. And is because this fungus produces metabolites that kill other fungi. Who knows if that's what it's supposed to do? Who knows if the plant and the fungi talk? It's just something that happens. So it's a lot like those zone lines that we talked about in the spalting example. So this is that little cute Leoshiomycetes fungus, and it is producing chemicals that prevented the fungus that kills the Hemlock woolly adelgid from growing. So in the environment, 35% of the time, I got this little cute pink colony of fungi that was killing my biocontrol fungus, and it just kind of stopped the project from being a viable biocontrol effort. So there's another sham that is possible in the symbiotic world. Don't buy orchid seeds on the internet. You can find orchid seeds on Etsy, but I guarantee they're not going to grow because these orchid seeds don't have an endosperm. They rely solely on the ability of fungi that are in the soil to colonize them and to support the seed as it grows into a plant. And so these are the seeds of the pink lady slipper. And you can see there's literally millions of them in a single seed pod. And you might say, well, why aren't there millions of cypripediums all over the place? It's because the plant likely makes a ton of seeds because there's not many of this fungus around. And usually when you find pink lady slippers, they're in a colony because the fungus is there. It's a whole symbiotic relationship. So buying cypripedium seeds on the internet isn't going to work out for you. So I just wanted to talk about these quick little, if you got inspired by this, some symbiotic research that you could think about or dive into. These symbiotic fungi are being looked into remediation. So like after a timber cut, can we apply fungi to make what we want grow back faster or prevent things from growing there? We can get metabolites out of those endophytes and look at all their crazy chemicals that stop other fungi or viruses from growing. There's many culinary avenues that people are trying to figure out how can we grow morels, right? Because people love morels, but they grow in these really cryptic relationships that people are trying to understand. And culturing those orchid-associated fungi, could you imagine if you could sell pink lady slippers at a nursery? You'd be a billionaire. And environmental pressures alter the roles of endophytes. So sometimes when those endophytes are in a different environment or with a different host, they kind of go haywire and they can kill a tree instead of just existing and not doing anything. So there's a lot of fun stuff that you can look up on your spare time, because I know everybody has a bunch of that, but it's just things to make your brain work. So let's move on to the bad group of plant pathogens. And again, that's our personification of bad. These things are existing in their own ecosystem, doing their own thing. And that's just the role that evolution pushed them towards. But plant pathogens are in the fungal world, because bacteria and stuff can be pathogens too. But it's when a fungus utilizes the plant's chemical makeup directly as a food source while utilizing secondary compounds and enzymes to destroy it. So it has a chemical warfare again that it's using to actively kill a healthy tree and eat it. So there's generalists and there's specialist pathogens. And there are also 5 main types. So there's canker diseases, like this picture here showing a canker growing on the side of an oak tree. We have vascular wilt diseases that make the plants wilt, like verticillium on maples is a big one. Leaf spot diseases, think of the tar spot on maples in urban environments. Root rot diseases are really bad. And then we also have rust diseases, like this ribes here, or this pine out west that had oozing pustules from a rust fungus. And they all have different management techniques, and that's mostly, you could have 90 million thousand presentations on each of these things and how to manage them individually. But plant pathogens have a long relationship with humans. Ancient peoples attributed plant diseases to the wrath of gods, and the Romans actually have a particular deity called Robigus, and he is the god of rust fungi. So he was praised or presented sacrifices to virgins, of course, to stop wheat rust. It didn't work out too well because it's really weather dependent and not on, magic, but he exists, and there's actually statues of someone associated with a plant pathogen. Ergotism in medieval Europe was caused by a plant pathogen. So the whole LSD thing, that's caused by Claviceps purpurea. When people were eating bread made with rye, these fungal sclerotia would get in the bread, and it would cause people to lose their limbs and to hallucinate. So this is an artist rendering of the days when medieval times had a lot of pathogens in their bread. And of course, this is not fungi, but it is often lumped in with fungi. There's an organism that is very similar to fungi. It's a mycotin organism, but it is the reason that many of us are Irish to 1/16th because millions of Irish people migrated to America during the potato blight era. So these things, like I said, they are natural system of checks and balances, even though we think that they're really bad, right? Having to leave your home country of Ireland to go to America because there's no food is pretty bad for us, but these things exist without us in the environment, and they play a specific role of having a balanced forest, right? And so one of the reasons that we have such a diverse forest is because there's things like diseases that kind of weed out other species and make certain species stronger or have different genetic abilities to thrive in an environment. But we hear about plant pathogens a lot because our world is so global nowadays that you can have a pathogen from an unadapted environment come to another country and it causes death. Like the oak wilt is a very big problem in the Midwest and parts of the East. But sometimes we can utilize plant pathogens to our advantage, and this is an example of a really problematic tree species, tree of heaven, which is all over the entire country, but really heavy in places like Virginia and Pennsylvania. There is a plant pathogen that kills tree of heaven, and when it's applied in the right dosage and with the right technique, can remove tree of heaven from a landscape, especially in areas like timber cuts, where tree of heaven comes back and it's like a monoculture. You can utilize this fungus soon, and it'll take care of one of the problems, and then mile a minute will come in and something else and something else. But how can you lessen the impact of plant pathogens? Because I know you guys do a lot with landscaping. You can utilize fungicides. You can also chemically remove trees that have, or mechanically remove trees that have, an infection. But really, the right tree in the right place is a big thing we talk about in urban forestry, of planting trees in an environment that they're adapted to so they don't get predisposed to getting sick from a disease. And also thinking about varieties of plants that are produced from plant husbandry, where you have a cultivar that is resistant to such and such a disease. And that's actually a really big science that's been around for a long time, right? We figured out that if we bred these two animals or organisms together, we would get something else. Well, there's a tomato that is resistant to the organism that caused the Irish potato famine. And I know it's potato and tomato, but they're in the same family and they both get the disease, as well as being resistant to fusarium and verticillium, which are both plant pathogens. And here's a scientist, his name is Manning Gallagly. He worked at West Virginia University. He spent his entire career making a tomato that was resistant to diseases. And just by breeding plants. So he would take two that looked really good and he would breed them, and then he would make it that the plant didn't get any diseases at all because of the genetic transfer through plant husbandry. So current research on plant pathogens, the possibilities are endless. Seriously, you can do anything and everything. But like I was saying, that plant variety hybridization is a really big science that still exists today. You could do invasive species control. And then this is a new exciting thing where GMOs are being considered to make plants resistant to pathogens, such as the American chestnut, which gets this canker disease. If they put a wheat gene into chestnut trees, it makes it that it doesn't get infected as crazily or die. And we might have American chestnuts one day in the forest when we have great-great-great-great-grandchildren. Okay, so this is a fun one, role reversal, where instead of the fungus being the problem or the bad guy, there are examples where the plant can be in a relationship and be the bad guy that's stealing nutrients from the fungus as the parasite. So the mycoheterotrophs, I love words. Myco is fungus, hetero is other, troph is just food and energy, how it goes down. So these are plants that are getting their food from another source, fungus, right? And so if you look at these plants, all of them are lacking the color green because they don't have chloroplasts because they are heterotrophs. So we have a couple fun examples here of plants that are in a parasitic relationship where they steal their carbon from fungi, which are in a symbiotic relationship. So these are fungi that are those ectomycorrhizal organisms in a relationship with a tree, and the plants are then attached to those hyphae and are stealing. So it's really interesting combination, or kind of a cascading effect of ecological specificity. And there are more than 400 achlorophylls, which means they're lacking chlorophyll plant species around the world, and their principal source of carbon is from fungi that are in a relationship with trees. And it can be either the arbuscular or the ectomycorrhizal fungi, and there's also full or partial parasites. But this is one of my favorites from California, the snow plant, beautiful red coloration, grows up in the snow, but it is a parasite of a fungus that is under the ground, and it just attaches with its roots and steals its energy from a fungus that is in a relationship with trees. Another example that's probably closer to home are the ghost pipes or the pine sap. These are definitely all over the place in the summertime, all the way into fall, and they are stealing their sugar source from things that look like this, that are in the Russelaceae or Trichlomataceae. And there's also, I love new discoveries because I just want to remind you that science is always ever evolving. You guys might watch this talk next year and be like, wow, everything she said is wrong because someone made a new discovery. And here's a discovery that these plants don't always have to be stealing from fungi that are in a symbiotic relationship. They can also be stealing from saprophytic fungi, which is our next group of fungi we're going to talk about. But those are the ones that are eating and decaying dead things. So saprotrophs are eating stuff and there's no relationship going on, but there are specific mycoheterotrophs that utilize that as a relationship and they steal sugar from them. So those saprotrophs, that's what you see eating your berries that get a little bit older or sitting on the counter or rotting fruit in the compost bin. But you can thank these fungi for the ability for you to walk through the woods without having to swim and push through piles and piles of debris, right? Because fungi are unique in that they have the ability to break down really complex chemical molecules, such as lignin. So lignin is what is made out of wood. If you were to eat wood, you would not be able to digest it. You would not have a bad time. But fungi are able to break down lignin. Look at how intense this lignin molecule is and how many organic rings there are with really strong bonds. You need to have a really specialized enzyme artillery to break that down. And this is really important because different fungi all have different abilities to break down these lignin in different parts, and they can make it easier for other fungi to become nutrient cyclers and continue to break that chain into smaller and smaller molecules. So we have things like the oyster mushrooms, and you can see it's degrading this wood, causing like a white rot here. And that allows other organisms of fungi to kind of colonize that wood because it's a lot easier. So there's different strengths of fungi and their ability to break down decaying wood or other stuff. And this is a fun experiment we did a couple of years ago where we took fungi and we wanted to see if they had the different abilities to break down the same type of wood. So we made these little blocks of wood that were all the same size and we weighed them all, and then we inoculated them with fungus, with different types of fungi. And then we weighed them and measured them, and also used a really specific machine to measure their breaking point. And there are different types of fungi that can break things down in different ways. and they make it able for other stuff to colonize it. So this is what scientists are doing while you're sleeping. just random science to answer one simple question. But there's a lot of current research going on with saprotrophs because we have a lot of garbage and debris and all sorts of stuff going on. But there have been some fungi that have been able to degrade plastic. Again, that's not a living organism. It's just a really hardcore molecule chain. So there are these oyster mushrooms that can degrade plastic, but they're working on it to make it even stronger. There are fungi that can eat your dead body. You can get a human body suit when you pass, and oyster mushrooms will eat some of you. And there's also a lot of research going on about fungi that are just living in the soil, breaking down the soil layer more, right? And it's because this is all carbon, right? So the first mushroom broke down the lignin to make smaller carbon chains, and then that carbon is just being stored in many different types of fungi. So this is carbon sequestration without making huge big trees or more biomass. It's just biomass under the soil. So in order to understand a lot of these things and incorporating fungi in your field of work, because it's already being incorporated without you knowing about it, but if you want to learn more about what's going on in your backyard or in your landscaping situation, you have to know what things are and how they interact with what's already there, because many of these fungi associate with a narrow group of plants. Some of them are really specific. Like, look at this field guide. It says macrofungi associated with oaks of eastern North America. And then there's even field guides that are just of West Virginia and the Central Appalachians. So like you have things like the ecoregion or the climate that are really affecting what can grow in your area. There is not a one size fits all. And there's, new rules with every situation. But for the most part, fungi require moisture. They have specific temperature regimes, and they need a continuous substrate, right? So once they run out of a food, if your log completely decays away, that mushroom's not going to be there anymore because its food's gone. It's going to have to rely on its spores going somewhere else to continue the life cycle. And they are part of a co-evolved ecosystem where they're just really dependent on someone else because they so specifically developed enzymes to interact with whatever they're interacting with. And how you can incorporate fungi in your profession and general life, it's fun. You can actually plant some fungi just like plants for design or for food production. This is a picture from my garden. I had wine caps, which are an edible fungus, and I just thought that they were so beautiful just growing in the mulch in my garden. I had a beautiful fern bed that I used non-treated mulch or non-dyed mulch, hardwood, and I put one of these mushrooms in there, smashed it up, the spores and the mycelium started eating that mulch, and then they grew and they were just a really cute little accoutrement to my garden. And fungi can be introduced to gardens to help certain species of plants thrive. So a lot of that, the Invam collection that I showed you in those tubes, all those grasses, those are things that could probably be applied to big remediation projects with native plant seed to help establish these little tiny plants get more water, get more nutrients in a probably degraded area. Because whenever we're doing these remediation projects, the world has been so devastated by forestry and all sorts of agriculture and everything. The soil's not as good as it should be for plants sometimes. And you can just promote diversity by planting diversity. So if you want to see more different types of fungi in your garden or forest, plant different types of trees because they're all related, or you could just plant different types of herbaceous stuff. And if you go mushroom picking and you just like pick these up because you think you're pretty and you want to photograph them, you can just hurl them in your backyard afterwards, and you might actually inoculate your forest with these beautiful purple mushrooms. So really, it's an interesting aspect of how we can introduce fungi into our environment. And as a closing note, I do want to remind you that fungi are very popular right now. I don't know what happened, but fungi are like the recent clickbait source. Like you can find any kind of article you want about fungi, and some of them are based in truth, but a lot of them are just to get you to get clicks. So be sure that you kind of back up those claims on Google Scholar and make sure the sources are recent and things like that. But with that, I will check the chat, or if that's something that Zach and Molly do, we can check the chat, and we have a couple minutes for questions. Appreciate your time.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yay, thanks.
Also, so cool that you quote unquote planted wine cap mushrooms. I would have never thought to do that. That's so
It's
neat.
incredibly easy. If you have a friend that has them, all of your friends will have it, as long as you have the substrate, right, for them to live. So it would be the mulch that isn't treated with chemicals. There are some companies that sell like bags of it. Olga, she sells it. I'll have to find her. Smugtown mushrooms, that's what it is. Smugtown mushrooms. She sells those bags of wine caps, and you just launch it into the mulch and mash it up, and it's good to go.
We actually have a question related to that just came in, so I can segue right into that, which is if you could list some more fungi that are easy to grow in a backyard woodland setting.
Well, I have seen people successfully grow morels from launching the morel wash water into their forest. So, and I've seen it with other species too. Like if you collect edible mushrooms and you put them in like a salad spinner to wash them off, that water is going to be filled with their spores, and then you can launch it into the woods. But think about, the whole thing of fungi, they need their substrate. So if you found the morels growing where there's a bunch of tulip poplar and elm, and then you go home and your yard just has Norway spruce, is it going to work out? Right. So you need to have a diverse or specific environment for whatever you want to grow there. But yeah, the spores are pretty durable for a little while, because think about it, they're out getting blasted by the rain. Moderately, they like being wet until they can establish, find who they're supposed to associate with, and then grow.
Awesome. We had a lot of questions actually in the chat around the types of fungi or mycorrhizae that can benefit gardeners and horticulturists or restoration ecologists. And I know that you mentioned that a lot of these, a lot of products on the market maybe aren't so effective because they cannot be separated from their host plant. Right. And so people are wondering if maybe you have suggestions for companies that are selling the mycelium or spores that are actually alive, and also maybe some names of some fungi that would actually be able to be useful in a garden setting.
Sure. So it's I can't say any companies, just because like I haven't personally tested them and like putting them on a plate and seeing if they're growing, or putting them on a plant. That would be a whole scientific experiment. But I do know that the INVAM collection at WVU has a lot of stuff that's already labeled for certain environments. And if you're doing like bigger remediation products or projects, it can work like that. Small scale, that it might not work out as just being like cost effective or, project based. But one thing that you can do, a lot like the wine caps, if you have a friend that has a garden that is growing really well and really successfully, you could take a scoop of that soil and inoculate your garden, right? Because if you have the same plants, like if you're just growing a big field of native plants, like coneflower and solidagos and asclepias, like if someone has a really good garden of it, you could take the soil and take it over to your garden that has goldenrod and asclepias and coneflower, right? So you're just inoculating by transporting these really microscopic things for free, and then you can see what happens.
That makes a lot of sense. For folks that are looking to purchase and use some of these products, we had an interesting question, which is that, is it a good idea actually to be propagating native plants for planting in the wild using these products, or does that end up posing maybe some challenges with, could we be introducing a non-local ecotype fungi that could actually be damaging or harmful?
Right. That is a good thing to consider when you're buying. That's kind of also a factor I think about when you're buying it from kind of gimmicky companies that are just trying to get you to buy something that's dead or whatever. Sure, that could happen. But the thing is, there's not really like a big problematic pathogenic community of those arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. They're so constrained to their job of being in a symbiosis with plants. There's a really low risk that you're going to introduce something that is problematic. Also, our area is so messed up already. We don't really think about that until you start to really study it. You're like, my backyard, it's been cut down, it's been burned, it's been turned into a subdivision. Your yard and having a garden where like those things were not natively there anyway, right? Because your yard was probably a forest, and now you have coneflower. Like, it's a whole level of thought that has to go into like, really, are you going to kind of pins and needle or like, pick at this concept? So I think it's fine.
Fair point. Okay, another question we had was, in addition to orchid seed, are there other seed types that depend on fungi relationships to germinate?
Yes, I mean, I can 100% say yes with the utmost of confidence. I don't know of an exact species I can give you, but there are definitely species that maybe don't require it, but do better off with the fungi. Yeah, I can for 100% say yes, but the big one that's citable and probably could open the wormhole for you to learn more about this would be all of the orchids. So all of the orchids, and especially those parasitic ones, they require the relationship with fungi.
Great. Do you have any recommendations for a good identification book or online resource for finding mushrooms or for mushroom identification?
Yeah. So am I correct in thinking that y'all are in like Virginia, Pennsylvania? Is that right? Or is everybody from everywhere?
There's actually a map when you enter the ELA.
Oh, that's right.
And
yeah.
I did notice there was like way more points along the Northeast. But
Okay.
but I did see kind of across the country as well. Even like, remember seeing some in Colorado. I don't know. Oh, East
Right.
Coast, I'm saying. Yeah.
Well, I recommend that book that I had a picture
Colorado.
of the macrofungi associated with oaks in North America, because most of our forest is oaks. And it has a lot of the boletes in there. And there's also Timber Press has some good beginner guides to fungi that are on a level where you will be safe if I'm assuming you're interested in eating them. I cannot endorse you eating them, but I can endorse you learning about how to eat them by your own. Timber Press has a couple of good regional guides for fungi, and they have like a nice little comment section that compares it to other species. So if you are like, oh, I don't know about this, you can turn a few pages and say, nope, it doesn't have this feature. And it doesn't require you to have a scientist's brain. You can read it and say the stem is 3 centimeters long versus 19 centimeters long.
Great. So I have a question here that I'm gonna read it. And you can see if I might be missing something, but what do you think about raised garden beds and with drought/heat? Do you think that the fungi mycorrhizae go deeper in the soil where there is more moisture? And if that can cause the plants to be challenged on top because of dealing with heat stress?
I think that the raised beds, unless you're watering all the time, are problematic. I know that I've used to have a huge garden with raised beds, and the fungi won't travel down. They will stay by their food source. Usually, like if you had a plant, the fungi are going to be like around, like a ball around the root mass, because it takes energy, right, to grow something that far away, and then also to transport and make the exchanges. So everything is going to be clustered around the roots really close. And so I think that having a raised bed, like one of those really high ones that are like those cow watering things, those are really high. But having the ones that are only a couple of inches are pretty good, because it keeps the soil cool, because it's connected to the ground more. And then also it's in that rooting zone.
Awesome. Thank you. Is there a certain face of a slope that's better to grow mushrooms, such as like a north-facing slope, for example?
So they're all very specific with what they like, but I have definitely noticed that they are more common on the north-facing slope, but that's because of the plants that are there. So on a south-facing slope, you probably have more dry stuff and more pines, but there are mushrooms that are adapted to growing with those pines. In our forest on the East Coast, we have mostly oaks. They'll be on both aspects, but I think that the more shaded ones that have the leaf litter where they're where they're moist, because fungi require water, like that's probably their number one requirement to be successful. I would go to the more moist side of the hill. to look for fungi.
Great. Someone asked if it's possible for you to share a link for the, I'm gonna pronounce this wrong, the leiotiomycete study that you referenced.
I could maybe find my dissertation. Yeah, I could find that somehow and share it with Peggy and see if she could mail it out to the list that's associated.
Okay,
But
yeah.
right now, there's no way for me to find
Yeah,
it.
not off the top of your head. We got a thumbs up from our ELA staff, so we can coordinate that for sure. Sounds great. And I actually see a raised hand, and I'm going to ask Zach, is that okay for us to unmute somebody, or should we ask
absolutely
in the chat?
We have full
Okay.
permission, so you can for sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Ross, if you
Great,
want to
thank you. So excellent talk. I'm an amateur mycologist, and so I eat them.
Yay.
But anyway, so I am actively trying to propagate the seed of native edible plants. And there's over 180 species of plants native to Northeast ecoregions that are edible by people. And a lot of them have mycorrhizal relationships, I'm sure. And some of the woodland plants, I'm having a devil of a time getting the seeds to germinate and grow into plants. And I have a suspicion that they want their fungal friends in the growing medium where the seeds are. And so lately, when I'm collecting the seeds, I also collect some of the soil next to where the plant is growing. And then I sow that seed in that soil. And I don't have proof yet that this works, but I'm optimistic that I'll get better results than trying to grow it in, the sterile growing medium I'm buying in the bag at the plant store.
For sure. The soil is 100% going to have something that will help. I think that's a really good hypothesis. Also, just the soil structure. I mean, if you're growing something that's, really popular, the Allium trichoccum ramps, there's tons of studies about the types of soil that they will grow in and the ones that they won't grow in. And normally ramps are growing in those like alluvial types of soils associated with creeks in Appalachia. And so if you try to grow ramps in potting soil, they're going to die because of the moisture level. So that has nothing to do with the fungi. But if you grow ramps in like a heavier sand component soil, you're going to have success. And so soil properties go a long way in germinating plants, but I would try that. I have done that without, as just my hobby hypothesis in the backyard, not a scientific experiment. I've definitely done that thinking like there's probably something here, but we learned about good fungi that can help. We also learned about bad fungi. So there might be some bad fungi there too, and you might have the seeds that die because sometimes plants produce a lot of seeds because they're overcompensating for things to eat them, right? So you should, I hope you have a lot of fun. That sounds fun. Sounds like a good learning opportunity.
So since you mentioned ramps, I want to tell you, we haven't talked about the awful worms, the jumping worms, and how they might affect mycelia. But one of the places I know where the wild leeks are growing in Eastern Mass is in soil where it's got that, coarse coffee grounds, diagnostic of the place that have the jumping worms in them. And the wild leeks are growing fine, at least the ones that are mature with bulbs, and they probably pre-existed the presence of the jumping worms. So what I don't know is, would seed from those plants actually be able to grow in that soil now that the jumping worms are there? And I don't know the answer to that.
There's probably a team working on that. I'm going to say no.
Great. I'm going to just do a quick closeout and then we can return to the questions because I know we might have a couple more. So I just want to say thank you, Kristen, for your time and for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. Because this is the last speaker of the day, we will not be going to the speaker's garden afterwards for additional questions. However, if there are more questions, we will stay right here in this room until 5:15 to continue the conversation. I just wanted to remind you, though, please complete the session evaluation, which can be found on one of the content tabs for this room. We welcome your feedback. And we did get a lot of good feedback in the chat. Please make sure all that great feedback is also put into the evaluation so we could capture it. And so this concludes the 29th annual conference. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for sharing their wisdom and experience with us. And thank you again to our conference sponsors, Pleasant Run Nursery, Understanding Ag, Soil Health Academy, TickSuit, and Ernst Seeds. And we especially thank you for joining and participating. We hope you enjoyed the conference. You can expect a follow-up survey in your inbox in the next few days, where we can look forward to receiving your feedback to ensure we are meeting your needs and expectations with events like this. And please visit the networking rooms and enjoy a happy hour with your colleagues. Some rooms are designated by region, and some are open for simply mingling and reflecting on these past 2 amazing days. Have a wonderful evening. So if you want to leave, you can. If not, we're going to stick around for another 15 minutes for additional questions. And one question we had actually was someone was hoping that you could talk a bit about the processes that happen between trees and different species that are linked by common mycorrhizae.
That was me.
Sure. One of the slides I had was about how science, like the last clickbait article thing I had is that there's like a really big argument between scientists that study fungi and plants and that World Wide Web. I'm on the side of like, maybe I'm a pessimist or a realist. I have read a lot of things about it, and I understand that fungi and trees will be connected, but I don't think it's this happy-go-lucky environment where they're sharing things, because, you know, trees, I think it's really a personification or anthropomizing. Wow, the trees, they aren't trying to help each other. They're just kind of, I think somebody else is in control more of the relationship, the fungus, than the trees are. So the trees aren't really talking to each other. It's the fungus saying, I want to survive. You're getting more sunlight. I'm going to take more energy from you. And just because these two are connected because of me, maybe there'll be some benefit going on. But just because it's like a big stockpile. But I mean, trees are constantly trying to kill each other. They're, you know, they shade each other out. They rapidly grow. They have different tactics to get to the sun first. They make chemicals to kill each other. Like, I think that the World Wide Web is a little bit more aggressive than the media sometimes makes it to seem. Do you have any more specific questions about that, or did I just go on a rant?
Maybe, and yeah, I guess you did, but it was a good rant. No, I just, you know, I'm no expert in this stuff, and, you know, one reads what one reads, and
Right, yeah.
interested on, you know, different people's takes, you know, because everybody comes at even their specialty.
Right, I might be wrong. Who knows? Right.
Yeah, well, yeah, we're all wrong about something at some point. You know?
How many religions are there? But anyway,
can't all be right. Right?
Yeah. But yeah, the mycelium, they do make relationships with multiple types or multiple individuals, and so the trees can be connected. Usually they don't do different species. Usually it's one species is kind of connected to maybe oaks, but they won't be connected to both pine and oak, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question to that, Kristen. You were saying that trees have all these ways to kill each other. Is that similar with the fungal world as well? Like, are they? I mean, they're obviously in cooperation with one another at some points, but are there also, you know, situations where they're kind of trying to edge each other out?
Sure, yeah. So the spalted wood example was really kind of small frame, like, you know, that's in a little area, but usually trees, they will be fully colonized by only like one or two individuals, and they'll be like very separated in sections of the roots. And it's a whole tactic. As soon as that plant starts to put out its roots or its real estate, like the fungi colonize it and they say, you are mine. Right? Think about that image or the figure of the Hartig net. The fungi were completely like encapsulating the outside of the root, and they mutated it so it couldn't make any interactions with anybody else. And then also in the other mycorrhizal situation, the AMF, the fungus is inside of the actual cells, like, you know, it's like fully inside of the cell wall, absorbing stuff in the cytoplasm back and forth. So it has claimed its turf. And you might have an occurrence where a tree can be big enough to host a few different species, but just because of its size. But usually once they are very young, they're immediately claimed. And then the relationship is for as long as one of them is alive.
Super interesting. Another question we have is, this person's wondering if you could talk about restoring soil that has been stripped and stockpiled for a year or two and then respread.
Okay, so the soil would probably be really degraded because it's been cooked and doesn't have an organic layer anymore, right? It's just like hanging out. Yeah, so that takes a lot of work. And if you are trying to make a garden, it is better to not remove the topsoil and, try to work with what you have there, which is probably going to be a lot of crabgrass or invasive species. But removing it and scraping it and letting it become sterilized and putting it back, it's actually pretty hard to colonize again because it's such a complex network of things that we fully don't understand or have listed or understand how they interact. So you may have sterilized your pile of soil and there's no longer this bacteria, which actually scarifies the seed coat that allows this fungus to colonize it, right? So if you put the plant back and you put the fungus back, you're missing the thing that initiates the process. And I just made that up. But that's, kind of an example of just how many players there are in an environment to make the best scenario happen. So it's better to work on a restoration area, I think, at smaller scale and not remove the topsoil to try to keep as many of those microorganisms there as possible. But I know that that's not always the case.
Great, thank you. And you did answer the question about best sources for, like the best books for mushroom identification in general, but we also have a specific question around good sources for edible mushrooms. And I don't know if this person means sources of, informational sources, or if they mean where to buy edible mushrooms. Maybe that person can, where to buy. Okay. So actually this person's looking for where to buy edible mushrooms.
If you're looking to buy wine caps or you're looking to buy shiitakes, I saw someone else mention that. You can buy spawn from this woman I know who she's great. Her name is Olga, and her company is Smugtown Mushrooms. There's a lot. She's in New York, so she ships it, and it comes in a bag, or it comes in those little plugs, and it comes with directions on what to do. There's also, there's a lot of websites now that have just mushroom spawn, but I would support Olga. But also there's, kind of a mushroom revival that's really happening. And I've gone to a couple farmers markets and I've seen, some mushroom nerd there that has spawn. And I'm sure if you even talk to them, usually mushroom people are really nice, or they're like just excited to get someone else excited. They might give you, something, or they tell you how to make it, or have a collection they didn't bring because they didn't think anyone was interested, and now they're going to give it to you for a price. So I think there's resources out there on the internet for spawn, and then there's also there's usually local communities.
Awesome. One question we got is, what trees are the hosts of boletes and chanterelles?
Most of your boletes on the East Coast are going to be associated with oaks because that's just what we have. But there's also on the West Coast, there are boletes, and those are associated with your pines, right? Because that's what you have out there. So those really big porcinis, those are usually associated with your ponderosa pine, your Jeffrey pine, other stuff like that. Every species of bolete is specific to its own thing. Oh, hi, Mimi. But yeah, that macrofungi associated with oaks in the Northeast is a really good book full of boletes. There's also a specific bolete guide. If you really want to get into it, I will tell you they are not the easiest thing to identify. But chanterelles, I find chanterelles in oak forests as well here in Appalachia. So just going to an older oak forest that has a nice leaf layer on the soil, and sometimes a creek, because water, right? And you'll find them growing up on the slopes because the water kind of percolates up a little bit and it makes a moist environment. So not a soggy place, but a moist, dry oak forest.
We actually have a question related to moisture. Someone asked, do you have any insight on the impact of lowering water tables due to climate disruption on mycorrhizal possible effects on climate resilience in plants and trees?
I'm sure it's going to be bad. I don't know. I would think that having less water availability would be problematic for fungi. They react pretty quickly to when we have a big rain, because mushrooms, just like plants, are really seasonal. Our season here in Appalachia is like the end of July and August. It also rains here a lot in the mountains. So it's really dependent on the temperature gradient and then also the rain. So we can have a rain and then in 3 days, we all know to go out and start looking for mushrooms. So I think that a lower water table will definitely affect the populations of fungi, if not because of their own moisture requirements, but also because the plants that they associate with are going to be struggling.
Totally. I know in New York City, where I'm at, we had a very dry summer, and the mushroom folks that I was following I know that there was like a lot of chatter around their city.
Bad year. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are there any good medicinal plants that accompany the same ecosystem as shiitake and wine caps? I wonder if people are into planting, perhaps.
Well, shiitakes are they're imported and they grow on logs. They do grow on our native oaks, but I mean, that habitat is great for like ginseng, I guess, and sometimes it's okay for ramps. Yeah, I think regionally those are probably the best answer. I'm also not a super knowledgeable person on medicinal plants. I know some of them, but I've made fun tinctures, but I've also, it's not my Bible.
Well, then we'll bring it back to mushrooms. And we have the question, how long does the mushroom body live?
Sure. Some of them can only last for a couple of days, whereas other ones you might see for a week and a half, like if they're bigger and more woody. There's also those mushrooms that grow on the sides of trees. We call them conchs, and they could be, 30 years old because there are annual mushrooms like the ones that you see in the forest growing from the ground. They may last like a week. And then you have the ones that are perennial that grow on a woody structure, and they will just keep growing every year. And you can get huge ones like the big artist conch. It could be as big as my torso if it's old enough and hasn't been kicked off by someone.
Great. We've reached, I think, the end of all the questions. We have a lot of compliments.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
You should teach to kids to make sure that, because science is fun. We got a lot of thank yous. We have another question from Russ. Is fungi involved, if any, with beech leaf disease? He says, I know that nematodes are part of that picture. Parentheses, beech trees grow one of my favorite mushrooms, the bear's head tooth.
Right. Yeah, I do find that mushroom a lot on beech trees that have fallen over. So, I mean, if we have more beech trees that die, we'll have a temporary bell curve of increased bearhead's tooth. Fungi, the beech leaf disease, the causal agent is that nematode, but there are people who are looking at if there is something else associated with the nematode, like if there's bacteria in the gut of the nematode that's actually the thing that causes the disease, and the nematode's a vector. So far, it's thought that it's just the nematode and its feeding process. But if the beech trees continue to die, and I think the younger trees are dying faster than the older trees, so you'll have the little guys dying first, which don't have enough woody biomass to support the bear's head tooth. We probably won't see an influx of that mushroom until the older trees start dying, because those older trees are getting colonized by that saprophytic mushroom. Bear's head tooth is not a symbiotic mushroom. So if you start to see that on a beech tree, it means that there's a lot of decay going on in the center of it and it's in decline. So eventually, if this disease doesn't get controlled or go away, you could see more, probably in like 5 years.
I have a question. So you talked about fungal controls that are being tested out for the tree of heaven. Mm-hmm. And I know that you also work on lanternflies. And I'm wondering, are there any tests being done currently around fungal controls for spotted lanternfly?
Yeah, there was a picture in my presentation. You weren't paying attention. No, I'm kidding.
I guess not.
I'm totally joking. I wonder if I can blast through time and space. It might not let me. No, it's not going to. Anyway, yes, there are fungi that are associated with killing spotted lanternfly, and they're native. So I think there's actually been 4 species found. Maybe it's still 3. No, it's 4. Yeah, so I think there's a Metarhizium. That's the one I'm the most unsure about, but there's a Beauveria bassiana, which covers it in a white fuzzy mass and kills it. There's also a backed koa species that's also native that kills it. And then there's a really crazy cordyceps that was a new discovery, like I think last year. So there's a lab, both at Cornell and I think Penn State's involved as well, but they are studying these biocontrols of spotted lanternfly with fungi that eat the insect. So they've like done some releases from planes and stuff, and there was success, but there's so much that goes on in the environment, right? I think one of the limitations, and I hope I'm not messing this up, was moisture. So if there was like a dry season, those spores would just land and they would just dry out and they would die. So it's like you have to time all this stuff really right.
Well, I'm glad I wasn't paying attention because that was
no, I didn't. I just had a picture. I didn't even mention it. I didn't even mention it. It was just a picture. I was just teasing you.
Okay. Any more questions? We have 1 minute. My cat keeps trying to walk on the keyboard, so he's saying, "You're done."
Oh, it's Kibby time.
Well, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Kristen, for this wonderful talk. And I'm going to give one last plug to do the evaluation if you head back to Kiko. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
And one more thank you. Thanks, Molly, for moderating. You were fantastic as well. Everybody was
great. Molly, you did a great job. Zach, thank you for having good communication skills. And thank you, everybody, for paying attention and having good thought-provoking questions at the end.
Yeah, and for sticking through virtual, long virtual conference. So.
All right, everybody, have a good night. We'll see you later. Bye.